Some of these you'll know. There are books, there are movies, the whole circus. But forget the Hollywood cut. We're here for the weird little details nobody mentions, the flashlight spring, the duct tape in space, the note in red ink. Real people, real terrible days, and some brilliant junk drawer engineering. Let's go. In early 1982, Stephen Callahan was sailing solo across the Atlantic when his little sloop hit something in the dark, probably a whale who never filed a report, and sank in minutes. Stephen scrambled into a 5.5-foot inflatable raft he later nicknamed Rubber Ducky 3, which is a very cheerful name for a glorified bath toy that's now your entire life. Now, his only source of fresh water was a set of solar stills. Here's the science, because it's genuinely elegant. A solar still is a clear inflatable dome floating on the sea. Sunlight heats trapped seawater, the water evaporates, and this is the trick, salt and everything nasty get left behind, because salt doesn't evaporate. The pure vapor condenses on the inside of the dome and trickles down into a collection cup. Free distilled water from sunshine and garbage seawater. Beautiful. One problem, his stills didn't work at all. And out there, a broken still isn't an inconvenience, it's a death sentence with a countdown. So what does Callahan do? He doesn't panic pray. He takes one still and dissects it, cuts the thing open to see exactly how it's supposed to function. He finds the flaw, understands the machine, and uses that knowledge to fix his other two. That is pure engineer brain under the worst possible deadline. And I love it. He didn't stop there. He rigged up a Rube Goldberg contraption of tarps to funnel rainwater into a clean little pool. And he speared mahi-mahi with a spear gun for food and moisture. His stills pulled in roughly a liter of water a day. Barely enough, but barely enough is the entire genre. 76 days later, riddled with saltwater sores and down to a skeleton, he spotted lights, and fishermen near Guadalupe pulled him in. He'd basically run a tiny water treatment plant out of 2 balloons in spite. Respect. Meet Eric LeMarque. Former Olympic-level hockey player, professional snowboarder, and in February 2004, an absolute cautionary tale. He went for one last run on Mammoth Mountain in the Sierra Nevada as a storm rolled in. Bad idea number 1. He took an unfamiliar route. Bad idea number 2. And then the mountain swallowed him for 8 days. He had no map, no compass, no food, and 15 feet of fresh snow to wade through at around 3,600 meters. What he did have was a little MP3 player. And here's the genuinely clever bit. While fiddling with it, he noticed the device picked up a radio signal, and the signal got stronger when he pointed it one way and weaker the other. That's not magic. That's basic radio direction finding. Signal strength rises as you face the transmitter. The transmitter, in this case, sat near Mammoth. So Eric turned his music player into the world's saddest, most beautiful compass and walked toward the strong signal. The rest is grim resourcefulness. He used his snowboard as a tool, hacking bark off trees, digging in. He ate pine nuts, tree bark, and, at one low point, bubble gum, which has the nutritional value of, well, gum. He slept on pine branches to keep off the wet snow, because wet means heat loss, and heat loss in the backcountry means you don't wake up. Here's the science nobody enjoys. His feet were freezing the whole time. When tissue freezes, ice crystals rupture the cells, and blood flow shuts down to protect your core. That's frostbite turning into gangrene. By the time rescuers found him alive on day 8, the damage was done. Both of his feet were amputated below the knee. And yet, he lived, got prosthetics, and went back to snowboarding. A man who navigated out of a death trap with a Walkman and refused to let it be the end of his story. Just maybe check the weather next time, Eric. From freezing mountains to steaming jungle. In 1981, a young Israeli backpacker named Yossi Ghinsberg went looking for adventure in the Bolivian Amazon. He found roughly 3 weeks of it alone, which is about 2 weeks and 6 days more adventure than anyone actually wants. His group split up near the Tuichi River. A raft went over a waterfall. And suddenly, Yossi was solo in one of the densest, least forgiving ecosystems on Earth. No knife, No map, no training, and a foot that was literally starting to rot from a fungal infection. He built crude shelters, foraged wild fruit, nearly drowned, sank into a bog twice, and generally got a crash course in why people don't vacation alone in the Amazon. But here's the moment that belongs in this video. One night, a jaguar shows up. A jaguar is not a threat you negotiate with. It has the strongest bite force to size ratio of any big cat, and it hunts by ambush. Yossi has no weapon. What he does have is a can of insect repellent and a source of flame. And he does the math that any frustrated teenager with a lighter already knows. Aerosol propellant is flammable. He sprays the repellent through the flame and turns a drugstore can into an improvised flamethrower. A jet of fire blasting at the cat. The jaguar very reasonably decides this human is too much trouble and leaves. That's the beautiful, stupid genius of survival improvisation. The thing meant to keep mosquitoes off your ankles becomes a fire-breathing weapon against an apex predator. And the physics is real, by the way. The propellant gas that pushes the spray out of the can is itself flammable, so the aerosol stream becomes fuel, and the can becomes a nozzle. Do not try this at home, obviously, but in a black jungle with a big cat circling, do not try this at home stops being relevant advice. Yossi was finally rescued after his friend Kevin organized a search with local boatmen. He wrote a book about it called Jungle, later filmed with Daniel Radcliffe, and somewhere out there is a jaguar that still tells its cubs about the screaming primate who breathed fire. April 1970. Houston, we've had a problem. An oxygen tank explodes 320,000 kilometers from Earth, and 3 astronauts have to abandon their crippled command module and crawl into the lunar lander Aquarius as a lifeboat. One small issue: the lander was designed to keep 2 men alive for about a day and a half. They now needed it to keep 3 men alive for 4 days. The arithmetic does not work, and the thing that's quietly trying to kill them isn't cold or hunger. It's their own breath. Every exhale dumps carbon dioxide into the cabin. Let CO2 build up, and you get headaches, confusion, racing heart, then unconsciousness, then death. The scrubbers that remove it use canisters of lithium hydroxide, which chemically binds the CO2 right out of the air. The lander had its own canisters, but not enough of them. The command module had plenty of spares, except in one of history's most expensive design oversights, the command module's canisters were square and the lander's sockets were round. A literal square peg round hole problem in space, with 3 lives on the clock. So a team on the ground, led by engineer Ed Smiley, dumped onto a table exactly what the astronauts had on board, and nothing else, and figured out how to marry the square canister to the round system. The fix, nicknamed the mailbox, was built from the cardboard cover of a flight manual. Plastic stowage bags, a hose cannibalized from a spacesuit, a sock, and a generous amount of gray duct tape. Mission Control radioed up the assembly instructions step by step, like the worst IKEA manual ever broadcast. It worked. The CO2 level, which had climbed into dangerous territory, dropped back toward normal within hours. 3 men came home because some engineers and a roll of tape refused to accept incompatible. If you've ever fixed something important with duct tape and felt a little proud, congratulations, you share a workflow with NASA. If there's a patron saint of improvisation, it's Poon Lim, and his record still stands. In November 1942, a German U-boat torpedoed the British merchant ship SS Ben Lomond in the South Atlantic. Poon, a second steward, grabbed a life jacket, went into the water as the ship went down in 2 minutes, and eventually hauled himself onto a small wooden raft. Then, he proceeded to survive out there, completely alone, for 133 days, the longest anyone has ever lasted adrift on a raft, and a record nobody is exactly racing to break. His emergency rations were never going to last 4 months, so Poon got to work like a man running a one-person hardware store. He pried the spring out of his flashlight and bent it into a fishhook. Spring steel, conveniently, is springy and tough, exactly what you want in a hook. He unraveled the hemp rope from the raft into fishing line. He crushed his hardtack biscuits into bait. When that first small hook felt flimsy, He dug a nail out of the raft's own timbers and fashioned a sturdier one. Catch a small fish, use it as bait for a bigger fish. A self-funding food economy floating in the middle of nowhere. He caught seabirds when they landed, salted their meat in seawater, and dried it into jerky on the planks. He collected rainwater in the canvas of his life jacket. At one point, he reportedly hauled in a shark, fought it, and drank its blood for hydration. Which is the kind of sentence that makes the rest of us feel lazy for complaining about a bad commute. In April 1943, Brazilian fishermen finally spotted him near the coast. King George VI later awarded him the British Empire Medal. The grim punchline: when Poon tried to settle in the United States, immigration laws initially turned him away. The man out-survived the Atlantic Ocean and got tripped up by paperwork. Bureaucracy, the one thing tougher than a shark. On October 13th, 1972, note the date, fate clearly has a sense of humor. A Uruguayan Air Force plane carrying a rugby team slammed into the Andes at roughly 3,600 meters. What followed became one of the most famous survival stories ever told. And yes, you've heard about the part where they had to eat the dead to live. We're not here for that part. We're here for the engineering. To get out, two survivors, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, had to cross the high Andes on foot in winter with zero gear. So the group built their gear from the wreckage. Snowshoes. They ripped the rubberized cushions off the airplane seats and lashed them to their boots with seatbelt straps. Why does that work? Pressure equals force divided by area. Spread your weight over a bigger surface and you stop punching through deep snow with every step. Basic physics, life or death application. Sunglasses. At that altitude, ultraviolet light reflecting off endless snow causes photokeratitis, snow blindness, which is essentially sunburn on your eyeballs, and just as fun as it sounds. So they cut the green plastic sun visors out of the cockpit and stitched the pieces to bra straps with copper wire from the plane's electrical system. Improvised UV blocking shades, made of garbage, and the masterstroke, a sleeping bag. The trek would mean nights in killing cold, so they pulled insulation out of the plane's tail section and sewed it into one big quilted bag using wire and thread. 3 men inside, sharing body heat, trapped under insulation. The difference between waking up and not. Equipped with junk engineering, Parado and Canessa walked for 10 days across about 60 kilometers of mountains and found help. 16 people came off that glacier alive after 72 days. They survived on the worst of human choices and the best of human cleverness. Here's a name history almost forgot, which is frankly an embarrassment. In 1921, an expedition sailed off to claim remote, uninhabited Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean. The team was 4 confident young men and 1 quiet Inupiaq woman. Ada Blackjack, hired as a seamstress to sew fur clothing. She wasn't a hunter. She wasn't an explorer. She'd taken the job to earn money for her sick son. By the end, she was the only one still breathing. The expedition's supplies ran short. In January 1923, 3 of the men set off across the frozen sea towards Siberia for help and were never seen again. The 4th, Lorne Knight, was too sick with scurvy to travel. Scurvy, for the record, is vitamin C deficiency. Your body literally can't make collagen anymore, so old wounds reopen. Gums rot, and you fall apart from the connective tissue out. Knight died in June, leaving Ada completely alone with a cat named Vic and an island full of polar bears. So the seamstress became everything. She taught herself to shoot the expedition's rifle and shotgun, partly to hunt birds and foxes, partly to keep polar bears, the largest land predator on Earth, from treating her camp like a buffet. She set traps for Arctic foxes. She built and reinforced shelter. And, in a detail I find quietly astonishing, she constructed a boat, a canvas-covered frame, so she could get out on the water and hunt seals and birds. She sewed warm clothing, kept herself fed, and held the line for months. She was rescued in August 1923, after roughly 8 months, largely on her own. The men got the expedition. Ada got barely a footnote and very little of the money. But strip away the fame and look at the scoreboard. 5 people went to Wrangel Island. 4 died, and the one who lived was the woman everyone had underestimated. The quiet ones, it turns out, are often the ones still standing. Now for a story with an asterisk, because even the people who told it aren't totally sure how it started. In early 2006, Ricky Megee was driving across the Northern Territory of Australia when, depending on which version you believe, his car broke down or he was dumped in the desert. Either way, he ended up alone and on foot in the Tanami, one of the hottest, driest, most aggressively empty places on the planet, where daytime temps regularly blow past 40 degrees Celsius. He walked for days, blacking out from heat exhaustion, until he found something genuinely precious out there. Water. A dam with a reservoir. Water is the whole game. You can last weeks without food, but only days without water, especially when 40-degree heat is wringing the moisture out of you through every pore. So Ricky set up camp by the dam and built a basic shelter. And then he turned to the menu. And what a menu. He ate leeches straight out of the water, raw. He ate grasshoppers, lizards, and snakes. And his signature dish, the one that makes this a DIY story, frog jerky. He'd thread frogs onto a length of wire and hang them in the brutal sun until they dried out and went crispy. It's revolting, it's resourceful, and it's exactly the kind of thing your body will happily eat when the alternative is starving. Low protein, low fat, but calories are calories when you're vanishing. By the time station workers found him 71 days later, Ricky had reportedly dropped from around 105 kilos to nearly half that. Basically a skeleton with a sunburn. Doctors described him as emaciated, but crucially, well hydrated. Which is the dam doing its job? Was every detail of his story airtight? Investigators had questions. But surviving over 2 months in the Tanami on bugs and frog crisps is not the kind of thing you fake by accident. You probably know the headline on this one. Guy cuts off his own arm. But the engineering of how is the part that'll stay with you. In April 2003, Aaron Ralston was solo canyoneering in Utah's Blue John Canyon when a suspended boulder shifted and pinned his right wrist against the wall. The rock weighed somewhere around 360 kilograms. He was alone. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. The cardinal sin of the outdoors, and nobody was coming. For 5 days, about 127 hours, he tried everything. He chipped at the boulder with his cheap multi-tool and barely scratched it. He rigged an anchor system to try to lift it. No chance. He rationed a single liter of water down to nothing and started drinking his own urine. And slowly, the engineer in him accepted the only equation that balanced: the arm or the life. Here's the gruesome, brilliant mechanics. The multi-tool's knife was so dull it couldn't cut through bone, and he knew it. So he didn't try. He used his own body as a lever, throwing his weight to torque the trapped arm until the 2 bones of his forearm, the radius and ulna, snapped. Bone was the hard part. Everything else is soft tissue. Then he sawed and cut through muscle and skin with that pitiful blade, used the pliers on the tougher tendons, and deliberately saved the major arteries for last to minimize blood loss. For a tourniquet, he wrapped the tube from his Camelback hydration pack around the stump. The whole amputation took about an hour. Then, freshly one-armed and pouring adrenaline, he rappelled down a 20-meter drop and hiked roughly 11 kilometers until a Dutch family on holiday found him and raised the alarm. The book and film are both called 127 Hours. And the lesson, beyond the obvious tell someone where you're going, is that the most powerful survival tool he had wasn't the knife. It was the willingness to do the unthinkable, calmly, in the right order. If Poon Lim holds the raft record, Jose Salvador Alvarenga holds the title for the most lost at sea time that sounds completely made up. And isn't. In November 2012, the Salvadoran fisherman set out from the coast of Mexico for what should have been a day of shark fishing. A storm hit, his outboard engine died, and the currents took him. By the time he touched land again, it was January 30th, 2014. Do the math. That's 438 days, more than a year. Drifting roughly 9,000 kilometers across the Pacific in an open boat. His young companion didn't make it. Ezekiel gave up on eating raw birds and slowly faded after a couple of months, which is its own quiet tragedy floating in all that blue. Jose survived by becoming a one-man wilderness. The standout invention. A bird trap so simple it's almost insulting. He rigged a stick where seabirds like to land, then lay dead still underneath it. The birds would settle, relax, start preening, doze off, and then his hand would shoot up, grab a leg, and that was dinner. He'd sometimes keep birds alive on the boat as a living pantry. Cold? Absolutely. Effective? He's alive to talk about it. Beyond birds, he caught fish and turtles and grabbed sharks with his bare hands when they got close, which is a sentence that should require a license. For water, he drank rain when it fell, and when it didn't, he drank turtle blood and his own urine. The science here is just brutal calorie and fluid accounting. Raw fish and turtle meat carry both protein and moisture. And over 14 months, that razor-thin margin is the only thing between you and the seabed, when he finally washed up on a remote atoll in the Marshall Islands. The story was so extreme that people accused him of faking it, until oceanographers ran the currents and confirmed the drift was entirely possible. The man crossed an ocean by accident and outstubborned it. Jonathan Franklin's book, 438 Days, tells the whole thing. Before Louis Zamperini was a survival legend, he was an Olympic distance runner who'd competed at the 1936 Berlin Games. Then came the war. In May 1943, his B-24 bomber, out on a search and rescue mission of all things, suffered mechanical failure and crashed into the Pacific. 8 of the 11 men aboard died on impact. Louis, the pilot Russell, Phil Phillips, and tail gunner Francis McNamara dragged themselves onto 2 lashed-together life rafts with almost nothing. A few chocolate bars, a little water, and a horizon in every direction. The rations vanished in days. So they turned the empty ocean into a grocery store through sheer nerve. They caught albatrosses with their bare hands when the birds were foolish enough to land on the raft, eating some and saving pieces as bait to hook fish. They collected rainwater in a tarp and rationed every mouthful. Below them cruised sharks that would slide up to the raft and test the edges. The men learned to fend them off, and on at least one occasion, flipped the script and caught a small one for food. It's a closed-loop survival economy built out of patience and refusal. Then it got worse, because of course it did. A Japanese bomber spotted the rafts and made strafing runs, riddling the rubber with bullet holes while the men dove into shark-filled water and climbed back to a sinking platform. They patched the holes and kept going. McNamara, who'd given in to despair, died around day 33 and was buried at sea. To keep their minds from dissolving, Louis and Phil quizzed each other endlessly, reciting recipes, replaying memories, describing meals in obsessive detail, which is, genuinely, a survival technique an idle, terrified brain turns on itself, so you give it homework. On day 47, they made landfall in the Marshall Islands, straight into Japanese capture and over 2 years as a POW. But that's the next chapter. The raft ordeal alone, immortalized in Laura Hillenbrand's Unbroken, is a masterclass in turning nothing into just barely enough. We finish where the Earth itself does the trapping. August 2010, the San Jose Copper and Gold Mine in Chile's Atacama Desert. The driest place on Earth, which is a fun bit of irony for a story that's about to be entirely about water. The mountain clears its throat. A single slab of rock, roughly the weight of 2 Empire State Buildings, shifts and seals the only way out. 33 men retreat to an emergency refuge, about 700 meters down, deeper than 2 Eiffel Towers stacked end to end, in air sitting around 30 to 35 degrees Celsius at nearly 90% humidity. A sauna you can't leave, with the lights going out. Here's the part that earns my respect. They had emergency rations meant to last 2 or 3 days for a handful of men. They stretched it to 17. The math was savage. 1 micro meal every 48 hours, 2 spoonfuls of tuna, a mouthful of milk, a bite of cracker. That's not rationing, it's a slow-motion argument with your own stomach. For water, they drank from the industrial radiators cooling their machinery and from an underground spring. Up top, everyone quietly assumed they were dead. Statistically, that was the smart bet. For 17 days, nothing. The drills kept missing because the collapse had physically moved the geology out from under the maps. Then one bore punched through into their gallery. And when the crew hauled the drill bit back to the surface, taped to it was a note in red marker. Estamos bien en el refugio. Los 33. We're fine in the shelter, all 33 of us. I don't care how tough you think you are. That line gets you. After that, the lifeline was a string of narrow tubes the rescuers nicknamed palomas, Spanish for doves, as in carrier pigeons, about the width of a grapefruit, and through them came food, water, medicine, letters, even a mini projector for movies. NASA got pulled in to engineer the diet and keep 33 minds from quietly unraveling in the dark. Finally, on day 69, they rode up one at a time in a custom steel pod called the Phoenix. The Phoenix, obviously barely wider than a grown man's shoulders, winched up half a kilometer of solid rock. Every single one made it. That almost never happens. And after everything we've watched these people build out of springs, tarps, duct tape, and pure refusal, maybe it's the perfect place to stop. Humans are at their most inventive about 5 minutes after the universe tells them they're finished.